All right, it looks like we've got most folks in from the waiting room. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and invite Kate Markert, Hillwood's Executive Director, to start our program this evening.
Well, good evening. I'm Kate Markert, Executive Director of Hillwood State Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. I am so glad to be with all of you tonight, including Hillwood members and friends from the Preservation Society of Newport, Rhode Island. Tonight, we launch into the lecture series for our current exhibition, Natural Beauties, Exquisite Works of Minerals and Gems. We'll gather virtually for the next 2 Tuesdays and continue exploring this really terrific exhibition. For those of you joining us in the DC area, I hope that you'll come see the show before it closes on January 3rd. The fall gardens, full of gorgeous chrysanthemums, are absolutely stunning. We're taking COVID very seriously, and we require advanced reservations and timed entry to ensure that you have an enjoyable and safe visit. And of course, the virtual calendar is also bustling, and I hope all of you will drop in to some of these upcoming events. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to share just a few reminders about Zoom. Your camera and microphone are not active for this program, but we still want to hear from you. Please say hello in the chat and submit your questions through the Q&A module as they cross your mind. Our moderator will get them at the end. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Wilfried Zeisler, is familiar to many of you. Before curating Natural Beauties, Wilfried organized the Balca de Vries War and Pieces exhibition here last fall, and Fabergé rediscovered, along with its catalog, in 2018. His next project is the Porcelain Flowers of Vladimir Kanevsky, which will open at Hillwood in February of 2021. Please join me in welcoming Wilfried Zeisler.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight to present this lecture on Russian malachite at Hillwood, which is our first lecture from the series dedicated to our current exhibition, Exquisite Works of Mineral and Gems, Natural Beauties. First of all, I wanted to give you some background of the context of our exhibition before we explore our malachite collection, and especially what we called internally our Malachite Room. You can see here on this first slide. The idea of this exhibition, Natural Beauties, was actually to focus on a lesser known aspect of Marjorie Post's collection, our founder, and especially her love for stones in general. We all know that she was passionate by jewelry, and we had an exhibition dedicated to her taste for jewelry and gems in 2017, but it turned out also that she loved hardstone and gemstones in general, and especially malachite. This exhibition is based mostly on our own collection, and our collection at Hillwood has over 400 objects which could be categorized as part of hardstone, objects. But we have over 100 from our collection that we selected for the show. And we have also around 35 loans from different institutions that you can admire in this current exhibition. Our collection, among these over 400 pieces made of different stones, we do have over 40 pieces made of malachite, and many of them, not all of them, are gathered together in what we call the icon room that you can see, as I said, on this slide, and that I will present you tonight. But first, let's start with what is malachite. So malachite is definitely gemstone, green, known for its color, the green color you can see here on this slide, and we will see many objects of malachite tonight. It's really beautiful natural pattern and design that was used to create decorative objects. And it has always been and often found in conjunction with copper fields because the green color comes actually from the copper. And malachite, even though it has been for a very long time and still today often associated with Russian culture, is a stone that you can find all over the world and has been mined for thousands of years all over the world. In the US, for example, Arizona is known for having malachite fields and has been used and mined in Britain and also in the Middle East for thousands of years and used for gem and decorative purposes and also used as pigment. But of course, Marjorie Post's love for malachite began when she went to Russia, and I will go back to that point in a few minutes. But when you explore her taste for Hardstone in general and her collection, which began when she collected like Western European art in the late 1910s, when she became a serious art collector, she already had actually some pieces made of malachite. Here's a portrait of Marjorie Post in the 30s, at a time when she had already amassed a very serious collection of works of art, including several pieces of hardstone. And if you look closely to several of our pieces, some of them being on view in our current exhibition made of different hardstone, you can already see at the beginning of her collecting her taste for malachite. Here is a very famous piece from our collection, which is this amazing tabletop she commissioned in the 1920s from Italy in this pietra dura technique, typically Florentine mosaic, using different marbles and hardstone to compose this very elaborate and decorative object as they were popular in the 16th and 17th century, and that she commissioned in the 1920s for her dining room in Mar-a-Lago. And this is a view of the tabletop with all of this decor, and we do have 6 additional leaves. One is actually on view and set in the exhibition space. These leaves can be actually added here on this table to make it even larger. But what I wanted to show you on this table is that, which dates to the 20s, if you look closely to a detail, as you can see it here, there are some minor pieces of green malachite, very easy to recognize here, showing that she already had quite early pieces made of malachite. Another example of that early taste for hardstone and for malachite is Marjorie Post's taste for Chinese snuff bottles. She began collecting Chinese jades and gems, and there is an entire section dedicated to this aspect of her taste and of her collection in the exhibition in the 1920s, and she collected them during her entire lifetime. And a few of them, a selection of those you have on this slide here, are made of malachite, date to the 18th and 19th century. Some of them connected with jade, as you can see here. And in the 1920s, a selection of these little bottles were actually shown in this case in the New York apartment she had in the 20s on 5th Avenue and 92nd Street in New York. So just to give you a sense of, you know, the idea of the exhibition and the fact that she loved hardstone earlier on, and also that she had some pieces of malachite before she would go to Russia. This trip to Russia happened in the late 1930s when she was married to Joe Davis, second ambassador American ambassador sent to Soviet Russia. And she will spend about 1.5 years in Russia. And there she fell in love with Russian culture, and she discovered the malachite heaven in Russia. Indeed, Russia is often, as I said, associated with malachite. Starting in the 17th century, 18th century, first fields of malachite were found in conjunction with the research of copper in Siberia and in the Ural Mountains, where many natural resources were found and explored and mined. And even though the production of the first malachite objects in Russia started in the 18th century, early 19th century, we will focus, because of the nature of our collection, to the pieces from the period of the 19th century. And at that time, malachite in Russia was actually particularly known for a specific decor made of small sheets of stone, which were cut to be assembled together. But before I show you an example from our collection, here is just a port of Marjorie Post, 1946, and next to the Malachite Room at the Winter Palace at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg today that she will visit, as I will mention to you in a few minutes. So here is a detail of one of our 19th century Russian box made of malachite, most likely in the Ural Mountains. And this is just an example to show you the technique, which is often called Russian mosaic, and which is actually a traditional technique which was developed with these kind of stones, which are not often found in big pieces, and which are easier to work this way. So they were cut in small and thin sheet of stones that were then put together to create a pattern. So that was actually the genius of the craftsman, who will assemble all these pieces together, use a natural design and pattern to recreate a motif, a decorative motif on each sides of these objects, and to make them look like they were solid pieces of stone and also naturally, designed. But when you look at this detail, there is a piece missing, so it shows you that how it's built, that it's not a solid piece of stone, that when you look at the bottom of this little box, you can see the thickness, very thin, of these sheets of malachite, which are usually glued to a base, which is either made of metal or made of a very simple stone like slate stone, like you can see here on this example, a typical produce from the Ural Mountains workshops from most likely around Ekaterinburg from the 19th century. So this was really a typical technique of all the objects I will show you, and that's how all the objects we will look at today are actually made. And so not only malachite became very popular in Russia, but also associated with Russia because of the role played by an aristocratic family who is often associated with the mining of malachite. And this family is the Demidov family. And here you can see a photo of one of the most famous members of this family, Anatol Demidov. He was often named the King of Malachite. He was known as the one of the wealthiest, aristocrat in Russia at that period. Actually, the wealth of the family came from their iron works, their gold, silver, and copper mines, and which were all situated in the region of Nizhny Tagil, which is on the Siberian side of the Ural Mountains in the north of Ekaterinburg, and which is still today a very important and significant industrial city in Russia. And Anatol Demidov, you can see him here twice. On the left, on this bust, marble bust made in Paris by Jean-Pierre Danton in 1839, which is at the Nizhny Tagil Museum in Russia. And on the right, a detail of the very amusing painting, which was done in 1834, showing him as Figaro enjoying a masquerade, a ball, as it was popular in the 19th century in Paris. Anatole was really wealthy, lived most of his time between France and Italy, married actually the cousin of Emperor Napoleon III, Princess Mathilde. Was an unsuccessful marriage, but still very prestigious. He also became Prince of San Donato, and his collection, an amazing collection, maybe one of the most fascinating collection built in the 19th century, was actually gathered in her villa in San Donato near Florence. And Anatol Demidov played a grand role to popularize, the image, I will say, of Russian aristocrats abroad, but also of malachite, because he founded a malachite factory, and I will tell you more in a few minutes about that, in 1847 in St. Petersburg. But the name of Demidov is very important to remember when we talk about Russian malachite and its success in the 19th century. And here, when I visited Nizhny Tagil in 2015, I took a few pictures, and here I wanted to show you that today still there is the memory of this industrial past is still a very industrial city, but on the left, this is now a museum, and this is actually the souvenirs of this presence of the Demidov and all their plants and other firms that they have built in this city, which we sometimes I surname Demidov City. So let's go back. That gives you a background of why we can call, Russia Malachite Heaven. Everything happened around the Demidovs, around Nizhny Tagil, where actually malachite came from originally and was mined. And then some of the products from the malachite were either produced and used in the local workshops, especially in Yekaterinburg, or sent to St. Petersburg and other cities where they will be used to create magnificent objects or decorative interiors. And that brings me back to what actually our founder, Marjorie Post, when traveling to Soviet Russia in the 30s, she didn't go to Yekaterinburg, neither to Nizhny Tagil, but she went to, of course, Moscow, but also to then Leningrad, so St. Petersburg. And there she really enjoyed her time visiting all the marvels and museums and collection, that were open to the public and available. And as I mentioned, she fell in love with Russian culture, and she had already developed a taste for heartstone. So for someone who loved pieces made of gemstone, going to Russia and seeing all these marvels and the know-how and the craftsmanship that Russian artists and artisans had developed since the 18th century was just fantastic for her. And we know for sure that she visited this really significant and very well known among many others Malachite Room, known for at the Winter Palace. This actually the room which was built in the late 1830s, right after the fire which destroyed a large part of the Winter Palace. Alexander Brulov, the brother of the famous Russian painter Karl Brulov, was hired by Emperor Nikolai I to restore the Winter Palace. And this room, which is between the private quarters of the imperial family and the official reception rooms of the Winter Palace, so it's sort of in between space between private and official and formal, was originally designed as a jasper room. So the columns and pilasters were made of jasper, also showcasing actually the resources of the Ural Mountains and of Russia to visitors. And in the 30s, so it was replaced by malachite, where malachite, a new field had been found, and it was very, very popular. So it was replaced by malachite, and it's still known today as a malachite room with a large collection of objects made of malachite at the Hermitage. And of course, Marjorie Post visited this room and was very impressed. But that was not the only marvels that she discovered while traveling in Russia. And as she said in some of her scrapbooks we have in our archives, she said, for example, quote, "return from all the beauties of the day." So she goes back to her house, to her hotel, and then she will just comment about all the beauties she has seen. And among them, as you can see on this black and white photo or postcards from our archives, she visited, of course, many spaces that are related with heartstone and heartstone history in Russia. And you have also to understand and remember that she visited all these places that were open as museums, and before actually the Second World War and before the destruction of the Second World War. For example, here you can see on this slide on the right, she visited in Tsarskoye Selo in the suburb of St. Petersburg, the famous Lapis Room or Lyon's room, which was named Lyon Room because of the silk which came from the Lyon, known for its silk, or Lapis Room because of the lapis lazuli furniture, which still exists. And the room has been destroyed during the Second, or heavily damaged during the Second World War, and it's now restored, and you can admire it again, open again to the public only a few years ago. So she will visit that, but related to malachite, she will also visit St. Isaac Cathedral, this amazing cathedral built in St. Petersburg by the French architect Auguste Ricard de Montferrand, which was completed in 1858. And as she said on her scrapbook, St. Isaac Leningrad, where the wonderful malachite and lapis columns are. And it's true that the iconostasis in this cathedral, it's magnificent. It's um, really as very, it's fascinating when you are in this church and in this cathedral. And she was really impressed by these pieces. And so what she visited, what she saw, we have also to remember and understand that at the same period, so she will visit all these marvels, all these pieces made of hardstone, made of malachite in Russia. And at the same time, when she was traveling in Moscow, Odessa, Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and so on, she will also go to the state-run antique shops. Since the Russian Revolution, actually, many of the heritage that had been confiscated from the aristocratic collections, from the imperial collection, were offered for sale officially in state-run antique shops. And she will visit them and she will select objects that became the nucleus of her collection, and knowing that she will actually somehow save them from an unknown fate if they would have stayed in these shops in Russia. And so seeing these marvels, she was then able to most likely buy pieces from these state-run shops made of hardstone. We know for sure that she acquired pieces made of lapis lazuli while in Russia and that are now part of our collection. We don't know for sure about the malachite pieces. We don't have necessarily all the information, but as we know, many of them actually were already in her collection in 1939 when she had them assembled, gathered together in one room in Brussels. When her husband, Sir Joe Davis, after Moscow, was sent to Belgium, to Brussels, appointed American ambassador there. And here she had her first Malachite room, if we can call it like this. And here we can see in Brussels many of her Malachite pieces that we still have at Hillwood, and that most likely either she acquired in Russia or that she bought while traveling abroad in Brussels, London, England, and so on in the 30s, after having seen all these marvels in Russia. So here we are, post-Malachite Room. So this is, again, from Marjorie Post scrapbooks from the archives. And this is located in what was the American embassy in Brussels, which was the Marquis d'Ache Palace. This palace was built for this very important aristocrat in the mid-19th century. Had been used actually several times by the U.S. For their ambassadors and their representation in Belgium. First time actually was actually in the early 20th century when it was occupied by Lars Anderson, who is also strongly connected to Washington, D.C. with the Society of the Cincinnati and with Russia as well, where he traveled. And he did some work in the embassy, and then it went back to the Belgian crown. The palace was used for the heir to host the to be used by the heir to the throne. And then in the 30s, again, it was given back used again to be rented to the American, as an American embassy, sorry. And that's where Marjorie Post will live. And here you can see in her scrapbook, she described each of the main formal rooms of the American embassy. And here she speaks about icon room or green room. And right after she was actually in Russia, she comes to Brussels. She knows she will live in this new home, and she visited, and then she writes down, "Could hardly believe my eyes, a malachite mantle in all its glory too." So the room had already a built-in malachite mantle, which is not anymore in place, so we don't know what happened to it. But it was really just an additional piece here for this room, in which she put actually all of her malachite pieces that we will look at right now. So here are other views of this room, and you can see how she displayed some of her Russian furniture, Russian portrait of Catherine the Great, icons, our famous Fabergé display case with some of her famous hardstone desk seals. Many of them are actually on view currently in the exhibition. But let's look closely to some of these objects because some of them are made of malachite. Let's start here with pieces that we know. So she acquired before 1939, so most likely from Russia, which shows her taste for malachite. Here, one of these very typical bowl from the 19th century made of malachite here in this very beautiful neoclassical design, very typical of the product of rural workshops at that period. Here, a table that the top is difficult to see usually because it's usually covered still today with our Fabergé case. So here it's actually on another table that we don't have anymore. But today this case and the treasures it contains is on the top of this table. That's why you cannot see the detail of the top. But it's a wonderful malachite top in the center of which you have a very good example of Pietradura technique, which is flower ornaments and this really beautiful butterfly. And you can notice, you know, one of these wing is made of malachite here. So it's a very typical, you know, Pietradura technique. And this technique was also mastered in Russia. There were a lot of exchange between, you know, Italian artisans and Russian artisans, and all these techniques had been exchanged. And it's also not a surprise that you can see this kind of association on this tabletop. And most likely this top is not genuine to the food itself, to the stand, which is in the Louis XVI style from the second half of the 19th century. But that's not all. You have more malachite in this room. That's why it could be called definitely the green room. So here on this slide again, three pieces that are still in our collection. They are hard to trace. We know they were in her collection in the late 1930s. They can be some of them connected to a few archival documentation, but not clearly yet everything has been found. So hopefully we'll have more information about some of those. But this one is definitely an association between a malachite, you know, tabletop with this older 18th century structure here of wood marquetry that you can see on the right, which is currently in storage. On view in our exhibition, you have this wonderful gilt bronze and malachite table from the second half of the 19th century. And that amazing table here is not in the exhibition, too heavy and too complicated to move, especially because it supports actually a very large clock by Fabergé in our collection, which is also an extraordinary example of Russian craftsmanship of the second half of the 19th century. So here I have some details of that specific table, and you can see this wonderful detail of this bronze of the foot featuring this griffin, which is typical of the, you know, workmanship of the second half of the 19th century. It shows you also that Russia not only mastered, you know, the malachite technique, but also were wonderful bronze makers. And the chasing here is absolutely, and the gilding amazing. And you can see that malachite cabochon somehow, which is made of many different pieces, as we have learned from that technique. And which is actually quite interesting about these malachite tops. We always assume they are like solid piece of stone, which is not the case, but also that they are quite solid, but they are very, very fragile. And that's also something that has to be taken into account when you look at this object. They are really, really fragile. And here's another detail in the same room where you had this table I already showed you, and the rest of the collection as well that she had built in the late 30s, the icons and a large collection of chalices that she, for most of them, bought in Russia. This table, again, is from the same period, second half of the 19th century, very high quality bronze, a nice, malachite top here. And what I like about this table is that it has a big sister, which is very far away, but tell us that actually definitely both were most likely produced in a similar area or in the same workshop. So she has a large, a big daughter, a big sister, sorry, which is in the Yekaterinburg Museum of Fine Art. The photo is not great because I took it myself when I visited in 2015 and again in 18. Here you have a wonderful detail, shows you the quality of the bronze and of this table, which is in Yekaterinburg. And the only, I mean, of course, this one is oval, ours is round. This one, each, figure here, feminine figure is the same as these, but the difference is actually instead of like just a bronze piece here you have a cabochon on this sort of somehow richer table. So that's what was present for sure in Brussels in the green room, or what's considered the first icon room that Marjorie Post had. So her chamber of treasures, where she had, her Fabergé, her precious object, her icons, her chalices, but also her pieces made of heartstone from Russia, especially malachite. The second icon room or green room was actually at Trigaron. Trigaron was Marjorie Post's home when she moved back to the US after the outbreak of the Second World War. So the couple left Belgium and then they settled in Washington, D.C. and they bought Trigaron, where she had her icon room. And here you can see her sitting next to a very important piece from our collection, which will bring us back to the story I was telling you about the demi-doves a few minutes ago. So this table was part, as obviously from this photo, of Marjorie Post's collection. Left the collection when she and Davis divorced in 1955. So the collection stayed with the Davis family and then had a different path, was offered for sale several times, and finally was acquired by the museum in 2006. And we didn't know actually the whole story about this piece, which has been discovered progressively. This piece is actually a very rare piece that was produced at the Demi-Dove factory. So I just mentioned earlier on the name Demi-Dove, how this name is quite important for the history of malachite in Russia, and that Anatole Demi-Dove founded actually a factory in St. Petersburg in 1847 to produce objects, decorative objects made of malachite. And he did that in association with the Leuchtenberg Bronze Factory, who did the bronze to adorn some of these objects. And here, this piece in this really elaborate Rococo or Rococo revival style, revisiting the style of the 18th century, was a produce of this lapidary workshop and was actually presented at the Great Exhibition in 1851. And here are details of the tabletop, and if you look closely, you can see, the separation between each pieces, how they are put all together to create this pattern, which is really typical of what is sometimes called the Russian mosaic. So, as I said, this piece had been shown at the 1851 Great Exhibition in London. This exhibition was one of the most important international exhibitions, the first actually of its kind, at the origin of the World Fairs, which became so important in the history of the art and the techniques in the 19th and even in the 20th century. And Russia was really strongly present there, and Demi-Dove sent magnificent and very impressive pieces of malachite. You can see them all featured here on this watercolor from the Royal Collection in London. And many of these objects actually have been tracked by some of my colleagues, especially Ludmila Bodrina in Ekaterinburg, who identified many of them and helped us with some of our objects. And actually here, you have the diploma, which is in Nijni Tagil of, which was given to Demi-Dove after their presentation to the Great Exhibition in London, and published, not seen on this watercolor, but published in an official report of the exhibition in 51, you had different illustrations showing the different pieces shown by Demidoff at the exhibition. And among those, you had a series of these Rococo revival tables. And it turned out that our table was actually one of the tables shown at the 1851 exhibition. And we know from our archive that this table was already in Marjorie Post's collection before 1943, because this is when she asked her interior designer, Fred Fogel, to cut it down, to have it fit, I assume, her sofa here, so that it was not too high for the display here and the use that she wanted for this table. We don't know exactly why she decided that. It was just an aesthetic choice, or maybe the stand of foot was actually damaged. But the bronze are all genuine, and for your information, all this is painted in imitation of malachite. So that's for this masterpiece from our collection, a really beautiful an amazing example, not only of the craftsmanship in malachite in Russia, but of the very rare piece known of the malachite, lapidary workshop by Demidoff. Pieces of this production are in the Royal Collection in London, are in Mexico, and so on, and one at Hillwood. But we have also other pieces in our collection which are related to the Demidoff. And it's not only because they are made of malachite, but because they have the name Demidoff on the top of it. So here we have one taza from a pair of bowls here, which you can also see in the exhibition. They are from the mid-19th century, most likely. They have this name Demidoff in Russian with the prince crown from the Prince of San Donato. And this piece was most likely part of an additional piece that Demidoff may have potentially commissioned to add to a large series of pieces we know he had, which was originally a big table centerpiece also to the tab. We don't know exactly when and if for sure these pieces were part of this set, but they are definitely related to the Demidoff, and they were actually in a sale in the early 20th century in the US, where other pieces from that set were offered for sale. And and later on in 1944, they were acquired by Marjorie Post, again by Fred Fogel, her interior designer. And the connection with the Demidoff and the malachite was so strong that Marjorie Post decided in 1969, I will say, advised by her curator, Marvin Ross, who was suggesting, her about the growth of the collection, to acquire a few pieces from a very important Demidoff sale, which happened in 1969, when the heir to the family sold the content of another villa they had in Italy, which was owned by the nephew of Anatole Demidoff, Paul Demidoff, the villa of Pratolino. And it was an amazing sale, and she tried to buy several objects, and she was only able to buy one portrait because, it had a huge success of a member of the Demidoff family, not one of the most famous one, but a member of the family. And the idea was actually to have this portrait in the collection so that it could be connected to the other Demidoff pieces, especially these two malachite tazzi that she already had, and having them together was a way to share the story as I am doing tonight, and how Marjorie Post had her vision for her collection, always choosing objects with stories that make sense and could be easily shared with the public. So that's about, malachite and the Demidoff. And we also talk about the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. And we have another piece in our collection that is related to this special event, where malachite was highly admired and recognized as sort of like the stone in fashion in the 19th century. And here is actually a very interesting piece which has been in storage for decades, which is on view and has been cleaned for the exhibition. And you can see it in the exhibition, which is this desk clock, which is a very interesting piece made of bronze with malachite pieces, decorative elements. It's malachite. We don't know if it's Russian, could be also English, because there were some malachites found in England. But it's definitely a piece as shown by this engraving in the center that was shown at the 1851. The only name associated with this clock is James Ferguson Cole, a watch and clock maker, an English one. We don't know who the bronze maker was. So it opens, it becomes a sort of like desk set with inkwells and different spaces that you can open. For example, you can open this compartment, so the malachite is covering the leads, and here it opens to put like a pencil and so on. So it's a very beautiful and rare and technically very interesting objects that I'm very happy we were able to show for this exhibition. And the pieces was shown in England in the English, department by an English watch and clock maker with malachite, often associated with Russia. And according to our archive, that piece was among the pieces that Marjorie Post acquired in Russia in the 30s, which I thought was really interesting. A malachite piece, English, but going to Russia and now in the US. So malachite has always been, successfully exhibited as a sort of like national illustration of Russian craftsmanship. And we have in our collection other objects related to the presence of such objects in international fairs. And one of the objects we have is this beautiful clock, which didn't belong to Marjorie Post, was given to the museum in 2006 by a family who said at the time when they gave the piece, that their family member bought it at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, which was one of these international world fairs. And actually, from the archival material and photos that can be found in Philadelphia in a library, by blowing up, photos showing the Russian display area, and especially the display of the firm of Österreich and Werfel, we were able to identify models that were definitely, shown at the exhibition, and which are really similar to this malachite and gilt bronze clock in a Louis XVI style, so a revival style again, typical of the second half of the 19th century. And which we didn't know it was a piece by Werfel until we found this photo, so which is absolutely great and help us identify more of our objects. And in the exhibition, not from our collection, but a loan, we have another piece related to Werfel, which is a loan from the Society of the Cincinnati, which brings me back to Lars Anderson, I mentioned earlier on, who once stayed at the Palais d'Ache in Brussels in the early 20th century. He was a diplomat, and he traveled all over the world. And while crossing Russia in the early 20th century, before the Russian Revolution, he will buy a few souvenirs, and among them you have this amazing bowl with malachite and gilt bronze, which they still have at the Society of the Cincinnati in their archives, the invoice. And I love the fact that already at that time, malachite was considered material which was strongly associated with Russia. So going through Russia, what will you bring as a souvenir? Somehow malachite, and an example here from the early 20th century. So going back to Marjorie Post and her green room or icon room, so Brussels first, Trigaron, and finally Hillwood starting in 1955, where today still you can find a lot of our malachite pieces. Here is a photo from the 1970s where you can see, two tables we already mentioned today. And on the other side of this room, in color, that's a display that doesn't exist anymore for various reasons. You can see on this display shelves a large part of her malachite collection, which include one of the bowl I showed you, many of the pieces I showed you already, which were seen in this one in Brussels, this one acquired in 1944, those candelabra later. They are all in the exhibition, and also in the exhibition a very modern piece, and I would like to spend a few minutes to present you this piece, which is absolutely amazing. It's a typically Art Deco piece, very simple in design. It's a box which was produced in Belgium, was first shown at the 1937 World Fair in Paris, an exhibition that Marjorie Post visited in 37, and she finally bought it in 39 from Fernand Collin in Brussels. And it's actually very interesting, I think, in how Marjorie conceptualized her collection of malachite. She loved that stone and her color and her pattern, but now she had malachite which was not Russian, but malachite from Congo, from Africa, because this piece was a typical example of, Belgium showing the resources they were taking from their colony, and malachite from Congo, exotic wood for the inlay inside the box, and coral, and of course ivory for this white color here. So a piece very modern, but adding to the collection of malachite she had in her icon room. And then the final object I wanted to show you today, which are the last part of the collection of malachite, how it was built at Hillwood, was a collection which was presented to Hillwood by the Rosso family. Augusto Rosso, you can see him on the right, was an Italian, a close friend to Marjorie Post and Joe Davis. He was actually ambassador to Soviet Russia at the time when the Davises were there, but he had been to Washington, D.C. before that, so maybe they had actually met before they met and became friends in Moscow. And his wife, you can see her on the left, Frances Rosso, was born Wilkinson Bunker and was a socialite from Washington, D.C., Chicago, and from the east coast of the U.S. And here you can see them framed, in malachite. On the right, 19th century frame from Russia. On the left, a 20th century made to match the other one, most likely in the U.S. These two were close friends to Marjorie Post, and in 1968, when Marjorie Post had decided that she will give her collection to the nation, to the Smithsonian, so that it will become a museum to be open to the public, so Mrs. Rosso decided to give the Russian collection they had built in Moscow at the same time when Marjorie Post was there, to Hillwood. And for this collection, a new building was set up at Hillwood, the dacha, in which for a certain amount of time the collection was shown, as you can see here. And when the dacha was used for special exhibition, in which you can actually now see many of these pieces, so the collection was moved into the house, and some of the pieces are on view right now in the house. So here you can see in this display from the late 60s, when the Rosso collection was given to Hillwood, this table and this frame, so the frame we already mentioned, and the table itself, it's one of a pair, and we still have them, and they were like, as I said, malachite is fragile, and some of the border were like missing, so we used the opportunity of this exhibition to have them conserved, so now they look wonderful, and they have been on view since we opened the exhibition to replace a few pieces that are now in the dacha. So now you can admire them in the mansion, and we will keep them in permanent view after the exhibition closes. So it's also the great opportunity to, this exhibition, to study our collection a bit further, but also to conserve some of our pieces. And so the gift of the Rosso family included several pieces of malachite, several vases, which are all on view in the exhibition. There are later productions, some of them from the early 20th century and some of them potentially from the Soviet period. And I particularly like those ones in the amphore-shaped vases, which are really beautiful. And you can see there are some missing parts here, so you can see they are all, again, the same technique, all these little sheets of malachite, glued on this metal structure. Other vases later from the late 19th century, early 20th century, but continuing the models and the shapes of, neoclassical vases, how they were quite popular at that period. And another piece from the Rosso collection I really like. Actually, the malachite part is just a base, but the bell itself, it's a miniature bell after the famous, Tsar's bell, which is in the Kremlin, which was one of the heaviest bell ever built, and which broke, was never installed, and became a sort of monument. And when installed in the late 30s, it became very popular. It's sort of like typical objects, a souvenir from the Kremlin, and it became produced in bronze, in different shapes, in different forms, in different materials, sorry, as a souvenir. And here you have an example of this bell on a malachite stand from the Rosso collection. And the last piece I wanted to show you from the Rosso collection and for our presentation today is actually this wonderful platter, which is most likely a bread and salad dish. So one of these presentation pieces, which was given during official welcoming. And this one is made of malachite. It's very similar to a piece which is now in Russia at the Ekaterinburg Museum in Ekaterinburg. And it's potentially a production from the Ekaterinburg lapidary manufactory. So that manufactory was founded in the 18th century and produced there many different objects in different, hardstone from the region, and potentially this one. And as I said, and to conclude, this presentation, which was an exploration through our, founder history, the collection, the history of our collection, and, Marjorie Post for malachite, it was also a way to explain to you when you will go to see the exhibition or when you will see, these photos, what we wanted to create in the exhibition, what we call our Malachite Room, was a sort of like homage of, the history of the Malachite rooms, not only the historic ones, the one from the Winter Palace and other ones, but also our own Malachite room somehow, which is now known as the Icon Room, and also an homage to how these firms like the Demidov lapidary workshops and later on the Werfel, how they displayed, their objects at world fairs. So that was the idea. And on the left, you can see when we were working with our designer, the maquettes and the model and how we ended up. And I think it's a quite successful, unfortunately not forever Malachite Room, but hopefully you will be able to see it before we close or right now on this slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Wilfried. That was fabulous. We've got a couple of questions already rolling in, but I'd like to invite our participants today to share any questions they have through that Q&A module down at the bottom. The first question I have for you is whether there's any difference in the quality of malachite when it is mined from different sources or different areas, particularly Russia or Kenyan. And I think you mentioned the African malachite deco designed box that's in our collection. But Grace Mo mentioned that when she's been in Russia, she has only seen vendors selling malachite mined in Kenya.
So definitely there is differences. I'm not a mineralogist, so I will leave that to the mineralogist, but definitely there are differences. And yes, I should have mentioned that none of the fields in Russia are currently mined anymore. So they could be, there are still malachite in Russia, but it's not mined anymore. So it's true that all the souvenirs you buy now in Russia, they come from Africa for most of them.
Excellent. And that is perhaps a question that can come up next week. You mentioned mineralogists. We have Jeffrey Post speaking next Tuesday, and this is definitely part of his area of expertise. Lynn submitted a question about whether the columns that were, I think they were in the American Embassy in Brussels, but it's possible that my brain was a slide or two behind when I clicked in. Whether the columns there were solid heartstones or whether they would have been veneer.
Nope. Veneer. That's an easy one.
See, I like to save you some softballs. Grace Moe asked where the lapis lazuli room was, and if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. The lapis lazuli room was in Saskrieselo, so in the Catherine Palace, was a room which was actually established during the reign of Alexander II and Maria Alexandrovna in the mid-19th century. Was a very extravagant room, was often called the Lyonski Saal, so the room of Lyon, because of the silk which was on the wall, which came from Lyon in France, which is known for the silk manufactory, and the furniture, which was a great taste of Empress Maria Alexandrovna. The furniture had been designed by architect Hippolyte Monighetti, has been produced in a collaboration with the lapidary workshops in Peterhof and the Magasin Anglais, an English shop, Nichols and Plinker. So the sort of trio of designer workshops and luxury good maker, which produced this lapis lazuli furniture. So the chandeliers, different table and different objects, which were all saved during the Second World War, were part of the collection of the Catherine Palace, and they recently restored the entire room and brought back all the pieces in there, and it's so-called either the Lyon room, sorry, or the lapis room sometimes, and it's the same group of artists who created our lapis lazuli cabinet, which was also commissioned by the Emperor Alexander II and Maria Alexandrovna, but belonged to another member of the imperial family and was in another palace. But that's the same sort of like, it's connected somehow. So I will say that when she saw this room, and I think when Marjorie Post saw this room, and then she saw that cabinet available in a state-run antique shop in Moscow, she must have said, well, that's for me. And so, but that's for lapis.
I'm so glad she did.
Yes, exactly.
We also have a question from Grace about the malachite table that was cut down,
Yes.
you said probably for the height of the sofa.
Yes.
And she wanted to know a little bit more about that shortening process, and if you had mentioned whether some of the malachite was...
well, I would love to know more. So the question, so the only thing is, like, when we bought this table in 2006, so we didn't know about the fact that it had been presented at the fair in the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. We didn't know that it was a produce of the Demidoff Lapidary Workshop. And so some research has been done after we acquired it. And so first of all, we made a connection with the print engraving we showed, and some listing, and some colleagues in Russia, I think, have had more information about the size and all of that. And the only thing we found is that in 1943, so that's why we know that this table was acquired before 1943, Fred Vogel, the interior designer who worked a lot for Marjorie Post in the late 30s, and actually sold a lot and worked a lot with her, for her, on malachite tables. He sends an invoice saying about the malachite table, which was shortened. But we don't know more than that. So we just know that this is this table and that it was shortened. And I don't know, because, you know, the foot itself, because of its curved design, most likely may have been complicated regarding, and as I said, it's quite fragile. So maybe it was because, I want to believe it was because it was damaged. So since it was damaged, why don't we cut it down so it's like meeting my Marjorie Post aesthetic, you know, or she wanted it lower and she asked to have it lowered. I don't know. So hopefully we'll find more, but that's what we know for this table specifically.
I love how many secrets you are still able to uncover as you dive into conservation and research, and
Yes,
I look forward to learning more about that table one day when we
me too.
find the secret. We have a question here about whether any pieces in the exhibition were owned by the Romanov family.
Yes. Not of the malachite pieces, but we have others which have a very strong, in the exhibition, which have a very strong Romanov connection, such as a bull chalice with his intaglio and cameos, which was commissioned by Catherine the Great. We have also a box and a desk seal, which belongs to, well, to Catherine Dolgorukaya, so the second wife of Emperor Alexander II. And I think there might be others, but at least there are those that I am just thinking about, yes.
Excellent. Did Fabergé ever use malachite?
Very good question. Very, 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 very good question. Not sure about that. He used a lot of hardstone, but not sure about, maybe, but I will say not for full or large piece, maybe as a detail, you know, in one of his figurines or like, but maybe I'm wrong, and I'm sure like the Fabergé specialist will send me an email tomorrow. But
well, then we'll learn more and we will
yes,
share that. But I do
don't
always
think
like
so.
playing Stump the Curator.
Not as a very large, you know, piece. Definitely not. I don't think so. Not sure.
And finally, the last question we have right now is whether St. Isaac's was damaged by bombing during World War II.
Oh. Not, I don't think so. I think there were like some destruction, I mean, damage in the city. Not, I don't remember about Saint Isaac's, especially damage during the war. Not sure. I don't think so.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to the end of our questions. And I'd just like to say thank you, Wilfried, for a wonderful evening. And thank you to all of our participants tonight. Thank you for joining us. And I do hope that we'll see you next Tuesday for Jeffrey Post's lecture and the following Tuesday for Jan Stewart's lecture. So we have lots of great programming coming up, and I will echo Kate's invitation to come and tour the exhibition. It is truly extraordinary. So thank you all, and I hope we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.